This is a CS Plus production brought to you by Baldwin Wallace University.
So in the last video, we built our star and we centered it in our web page, and then we also built our Earth, and we did some small animations. We did our black hole animation, which kind of makes a star or a planet shrink, and then we had our Earth move across the screen. But we know that the Earth just doesn't move across the screen like that, or across linear with our sun. We want to actually follow an orbit. And so that's what we're going to focus on today in this video. So the first step is we need to actually create an orbit around our sun. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're not actually going to make the planet move. We're going to make a plane that the planet sits on move. So if you grabbed a piece of paper and you drew Earth on it, what we're going to be doing is we're not going to be moving that drawing that you have on the paper, but we're actually going to be moving the paper. And if you couldn't see the paper, it would look like that the planet is doing an orbit. And essentially that's what we're going to be doing today. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create an orbit style within our style tag here. I'm going to add it below our star style. And at first, what we want to do is we want to make sure that this orbit is visible. So we're going to give it a background color, and we'll call it azure. Now, typically when we're doing colors, we either use RGB values or hex values, RGB meaning red, green, blue. But in this case, we're just going to use this just because it's temporary. And for my orbit, I want it to stretch from edge to edge. So I'm going to give it a width of 100%, meaning 100% of the width of my web browser, and then a height of 100%. And remember what I said in the last video, the way that HTML works fundamentally is almost like Legos. We start stacking these HTML elements from the upper left corner of our browser, and they slowly stack down as we place more elements in there. So what we want to do is we want this orbit to kind of break free from that building. And so we're going to set the position to absolute. And just like how we would have a planet in orbit, we're going to do the same thing fundamentally here. So our star in this case isn't orbiting anything, but our planet is orbiting the star. So I'm going to make a div class orbit, and I'm going to move that closing div tag there. I'm going to cut it out and then paste it below. And so I'm going to indent this so it's a little bit easier to read. So the idea is that that circle planet is within our orbit. Now, just in case you've been wondering, this indentation doesn't change how our HTML or CSS works, but it does make it easier to read. It makes it easier for me to tell that this planet is within this orbit. So now if I save that, and I go back over here and refresh, nothing too exciting, just a large white box. So what we want to do is we want to make it actually spin or rotate. And so we're going to start off by going back to our orbit class here. And we're going to set the animation duration. So how long will our animation take, just like in the previous video. And I'm going to say 10 seconds. And we're going to give this animation a name. So before we had a straight orbit, which really isn't an orbit. So we'll call this one true orbit. And just like how we created keyframes in the last video for our straight orbit, we're going to create keyframes for our true orbit. And just like how we had a from to here in our straight orbit, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to have a starting position or starting point in our keyframes, and the point we get to. Now, the way that we do our animation is going to be much different. So before we were just moving something from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen. But now we're actually going to rotate it. So I'm going to do a transform, which allows us to transform an object. And then we're going to do a rotate. We're going to start off at 0 degrees. So if you think almost at a clock, we'd be starting at 12 o'clock. And we're going to go all the way around the clock to 360 degrees. Now if we save that, I'm going to clean up this extra space here. If we save that, let me go back. It's a little bit dizzying, but we can kind of see a planet orbit. You'll notice too that if we were to refresh this again, it starts off slow and then it accelerates to a steady speed, and then it slows down again. So you see here it's picking up speed, it moves, and then now it's starting to slow down into place. So there's a couple of things we'll want to fix. Now that we kind of see that piece of paper that we were talking about moving, we'll also want to change that color so this way it doesn't look like a piece of paper. And then we'll also want to make sure that it doesn't start off slowly and then come to a halt. So the first thing that I want to do is let me add the following to our planet class, because our planet's kind of going off the screen. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a margin left. And I'm going to set this to maybe 150 pixels or negative 150 pixels. And I'm also going to put this in the center of our solar system. We already have our position absolute there, so that will work just fine. If I save that and come back and I refresh, it's kind of hard to tell, but it is there. We still got that one animation in there, which we have to take out. And so let's do this for our planet. So our planet, we're not actually going to have do this straight orbit anymore. So I'm actually going to take this out. I can comment that out, or I can delete it. I'm going to save that, then come back and refresh. Now that looks more like it. But, I don't know, maybe too close to our sun. We won't know until we get rid of this paper here. And so for the paper, what I'm going to do is go back to this orbit class and just take out the background color. If I save that, go back and I refresh. Here we go. Now, if that was Earth, might be a little bit too hot. So let's actually bump this out a little bit. So the way that we could bump this out is we could change this margin left setting here. I'm just going to increase it to a higher value. And part of this is just experimenting. So if you like your Earth being that close to a sun, you can leave it. But I'm going to bump it out a little bit. Go back and refresh. That's much better. Now, it would be pretty scary if all of a sudden Earth stopped. So let's fix that animation as well. So I'm going to go to our orbit here, and we want that animation to keep going. So the way that we could do that is by changing the animation iteration count. And I'm going to set it to infinite, meaning that it'll keep going and going and going. But you'll notice as it kind of approaches that end there, the animation, it slows down again. And so that's our ease in and ease out. Now this is usually a useful feature that we can use because the animation isn't so jarring. It kind of slowly eases in for the user, then eases out. But we don't want that in this case. So what we want is the speed to be the same or linear. And so we're going to change the animation timing function to be linear. And so if we save that and we come back and we refresh, we now have the Earth orbiting the Sun. Now, if it was just the Earth and our Sun, our solar system would be pretty lonely. So let's work on adding some additional planets to our solar system animation. So what we want to do first, before we start adding additional animations, is let's actually break out some of the properties that we have in our planet here that might be the same for each planet. So each planet we want to have start off in the center, and then we would bump them out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the attributes that are just specific to Earth. So like the size, how far away it is from the sun, and the color. And I'm going to create a separate class called Earth. So I'm going to take that width and height and move that down here. I'm going to take that margin left, because that's how far away it is from the sun, and put that there. And then I'm going to take that background image, which does the color of our Earth, and put that here. Let me actually expand this out a little bit so we can see everything. I'm just going to clean up some of this white space that we have in there, just kind of tighten things up a little bit. And if we save that and go back and refresh, it wouldn't look right. In fact, nothing's there. We need to make sure that that planet that we had created also has that Earth property. So if I scroll back down, here where I see that div class circle and then planet, I'm going to add Earth to it. And then that will get the color, the size, and the distance from our sun. So really we didn't change how things look. We just kind of moved where things were before, so this way we can reuse some of those elements. So let's go ahead and create one of our neighbors. Let's create the planet Venus. And we'll start off with Venus being in the same orbit. So I'm going to take our planet that we created here, Earth. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it here. But I'm going to change Earth here to Venus. Now for Venus, one thing that we can do is we're going to create the class here, is we could look up to see what are the colors of Venus, what is its size relative to Earth, and just kind of adjust the width and the height based off of that. I do know that Venus is closer to the sun, so it would make sense for that margin left value to just be a little bit closer to 0, meaning a little bit closer to the sun. So I'm going to change it to maybe -200, and we'll see how that is. We may need to come back and adjust our Earth here too. I'm going to use that linear gradient as well for our background. And I'm going to do kind of like a yellow to an orange. And we'll see how that looks. And Venus is a little bit smaller. So I'm going to set the width to 40 pixels and the height to 40 pixels. And we'll see how that looks. Not too bad. A little bit too close to the Earth though. And I can change that. I could make Venus closer to the sun. But I think what I'm going to do instead is just bump Earth out a little bit. Come back and I refresh. That's better. Now, I don't want all my planets to kind of be in the same line, if you will. So I can kind of draw like an anchor here from the sun, and it would or draw a line that goes through Venus and Earth, and it kind of swings around with it. So I'm actually going to start Venus in a different spot in the animation. I'm going to do a margin top instead of left, and it'll just start at a different spot. So if I go back and refresh, that looks a little better. So I don't have anything lined up in one line. Now, the one thing that we can add here, get a planet a little bit closer to the sun, is Mercury. So I'm going to follow the same steps. I'm going to take my Venus style, and I'm actually just going to copy that and paste it. And I'm going to rename it Mercury. Now Mercury is much closer to the sun, so I'm going to do maybe a negative 150, and I guess we'll see what that looks like. And then for my width, Mercury is smaller, so I'm going to make it much smaller. And even though I have the style here, what I now want to do is actually add the planet. So don't forget to add this piece here. And then rename that Venus class as Mercury. Go back, we refresh. Uh-oh. Did we forget to change the color? I think so. Let's go back and change the color for Mercury. Looks a little bit too much like Venus. So I want to make it, let's try a gray color. And I don't know, I'm going to do a white. We could always adjust this later too. I'm going to save that, come back, then refresh. It's a little bit like Mercury. We still see that Mercury is in line with Venus. If we were to take a look here, it still has that same margin top setting that we already used, and we already used margin left. If we were to do margin right, that would just bump it out to the right. So instead, if we don't want these to line up, really Mercury, Venus, and Earth are all in different orbits. So some go around the sun a little faster than others. And so what we could do is we can set an orbit for each one. So let's go ahead and do that. So just like how before where I had a base planet class, I'm going to create a base orbit class. So here I got my base planet class that has some attributes that each planet shares. I'm going to have an orbit class that each planet shares, or I'm sorry, that each orbit shares. And so each one is going to have this true orbit, but really what's going to be the difference is how quick the duration is. So I'm actually going to take that animation duration out. And I'm going to do orbit dash Earth. And then set that animation duration there. And so if I go down here where I have my div class orbit, I'm going to change it from orbit to, or add the orbit dash Earth class to it. And I want to make sure only Earth is in that orbit. So I'm going to take out Venus and Mercury by closing that div tag here. And now I'm going to do another div tag, which will be the orbit for Venus. And then an orbit for Mercury. And I'm just going to remove some of these extra div tags that are put in there. So each planet will now be in its own orbit. Now if I save that now and go back and refresh, we only have Earth moving because, well, we never defined orbit Venus and orbit Mercury. So what I'm going to do is go up here and then just specify the orbit for Venus and Mercury. Now we could look up the values to see how quickly they orbit the sun. I believe, and I might be wrong, but I think Venus orbits a little bit faster than Earth, and Mercury even more so. And so we don't increase the speed because that's how long it takes to go around the sun. We would decrease it if we want it moving faster. And so if I save that and I come back and I refresh, that looks like a solar system animation. Now, if we really want to get a view from outside, I can take my browser and I can maximize it. And if I want to zoom out, I can do that too. Typically, it's the control key and the minus sign, or if you're on a Mac, the command minus sign. And there we can see our little solar system. If you ever want to reset that zoom, typically it's a command 0 or control 0 if you're on Windows. And now that you got the basics of how to do this, a good challenge or a good thing to work on is to add some additional planets. So we can still add Mars, we can add Jupiter, we can add Saturn, and the rest of them. The other thing you can add too, if you're looking for a challenge, is the asteroid belt. You could try adding that in there, or maybe adding the rings of Saturn in there. It does take a little bit more work, but it is something fun to try to do. If you want to try something else, you can also try to have a moon orbiting the Earth. Now, this may seem like it would be pretty hard, but if you think about it, you're fundamentally doing it right here, where you have Mercury, which almost looks like a moon, orbiting our star. And you could do the same thing for Earth. Instead, you would just have an orbit around Earth, and then you would put that moon object in there. So now that we have the planet set up in our solar system, the next thing that we'll take a look at is how to add some additional features, such as stars in the sky and also a comet.